This is the Marketing Podcast Network.
Stories influence, teach, and inspire us. But what about the storytellers who create them? Uncorking a Story profiles storytellers to uncover how their background and life experiences influence the stories they create. We learn what motivates them, their path to success, and what fuels them to keep creating. It all starts by asking one simple question: where does your story begin? Welcome to Uncorking a Story. Now here's your host, Mike Carlin.
Well, hello and welcome to Uncorking a Story. I'm your host, Mike Carlin, and today I'm pleased to introduce you to New York Times bestselling author Jill Santopolo. Jill is the internationally best-selling author of Everything After, More Than Words, and The Light We Lost, which was a Reese Witherspoon Book Club pick and has been optioned for a film. Her books have been translated into more than 35 languages and have been named to the New York Times, USA Today, Wall Street Journal, Apple, and IndieBound bestseller lists. Jill joins me today to talk about her career and latest novel, Stars in an Italian Sky. Welcome to Uncorking a Story, Jill.
Thank you so much. Thank you for having me.
Oh, I'm happy to have you here, Jill. I have to ask the question I ask everybody as we begin, which is, where does your story as an author begin?
I mean, I always loved writing stories. I always loved writing. And I joke all the time that first grade was a very prolific year for me. I wrote a lot of stories then and discovered that I wasn't a great artist. So I gave my stories to other friends in my class to illustrate for me because, picture books. But I think, in reality, after college, I got a job in publishing. And I was an editorial assistant, and we were, working on all of these wonderful books. And I kept thinking, like, do I have a story that I want to tell too? And is it something that I could possibly do? And so on the side, I started writing. I started writing a novel. I work in children's books, so I started writing some children's books, and had a lot of fun in that world. And then some years later, I went through this horrible breakup, and I was kind of using writing as a way to process that, and that couldn't be for kids. So that was when I wrote The Light We Lost, and then that sort of launched my adult fiction publishing author career. So many careers going on. So I feel like, my whole life I was preparing to be a writer, and then there was sort of writer 1.0 and then writer 2.0 in the adult novels.
Going back to those poorly illustrated novels in first grade, do you remember the titles of any of them?
I don't fully remember the titles, but I do remember some of the plots. And one of them was about aliens who also were in first grade. And they were very similar to my friends in first grade, except they were aliens living on a different planet. But they did all the same things we did. One of the stories I wrote was a sequel to Grease, the movie, because I had a babysitter who let me watch Grease, and I loved it. But I thought Sandy really needed to talk back to Danny. So I remember I wrote basically Grease fan fiction when I was in first grade. And then the very first book I wrote, it was before first grade. I was younger. And it was called Stacy the Cat. And it was about a cat who turned into a mat anytime someone pet her.
Well, that's an interesting choice for a cat.
Mm-hmm.
For a cat.
Yeah.
You mentioned a sequel to Grease. Did you ever see the movie Grease 2?
Oh, yes. I love it.
It's one of those movies that when I was growing up was always on. Well, I don't know if we had Showtime or HBO, but it was like playing in a loop. And that song, Cool Rider, every now and then gets stuck in my head. And, it's not as bad as the reviews say.
It's fantastic. I mean, we watched Grease a lot, my sisters and I, and then I don't know if Grease 2 was out already and we just didn't know it until much later, or if Grease 2 actually just came out after we started watching Grease. I've never actually looked into the timing of that. But yes, it was on our TV too at some point. And then we started watching Grease 2 and then kind of abandoned Grease because we thought Grease 2 was so much better.
Well, you had a guy with a motorcycle, right? So right then and there, he was like
Yeah.
your kind of loser guy who I remembered the scenes where he was trying to learn how to ride the motorcycle and he's always falling. And then he becomes the cool rider. And,
Yeah.
Adrian's med be damned.
No, it was pretty amazing. It was an amazing movie. I wholeheartedly recommend it.
Well, I want to go back to what you said earlier, kind of your first book, kind of being fueled by this bad breakup. And, it never ceases to amaze me where something beautiful and wonderful can come out of a tragedy or a perceived tragedy at the time. What was it like kind of fueling your energy into writing during that period of your life?
No, it was something that I felt I had to do to sort of almost like keep myself together, because I felt like it was one of those situations where like, for weeks, every time I would talk to friends, I would like be in tears and I was like, all right, this has got to stop. Like, this has really got to stop. And I started writing this kind of friend, Lucy, who was also going through a breakup and was sort of channeling, like, her story is not my story. The light we lost is not my story, but the sort of emotions that she's feeling are kind of what I was going through at the time, so that I was able to channel that into something productive instead of just like me crying on the subway. And I think, because of that, the responses that I've gotten to the novel have been, a lot of people who also had gone through terrible breakups were like, I really, was able to connect to the story, and it made me feel a lot less alone. And I think because I was creating this book so that I would feel less alone, it kind of ended up, doing that for other people, because, losing love is a common human experience, and feeling that grief from a lost relationship for whatever the reason is something that I think, a lot of people have experienced, and knowing that you're not the only person who has had this experience is kind of comforting in a way, I think.
Yeah, it's one of those shared experiences that we all kind of go through, but because you're writing from that pain, even though it's not, quote unquote your story, people respond to the authenticity of it.
Yeah. Yeah, I think so.
Well, tell me, kind of moving from, writing, children's books to writing adult fiction, what was that transition like for you?
No, it wasn't as big of a difference as it seems like it should be, in that the way I approach writing a novel is sort of getting into the character, and sort of figuring out what the character would experience, how the character talks, how the character would react in different scenarios and different situations, and then writing the story kind of in that headspace. So the difference to me between writing from the perspective of a 35-year-old and writing from the perspective of a 10-year-old is just developing a different character who would have different reference points and different touchstones and a different vocabulary.
Yeah.
So process-wise, it was very similar. I just got to use a lot more of the world when I was telling the story.
Yeah. How do you get into character? How do you sort of embody a character when you're writing them?
I really try and think of a lot of details about them and who they are. And as I write the beginning chapters, I'm like using those chapters to explore them and think like, okay, if this person has this job, how do they see the world? How would they walk into this room, and what would they talk about, and who would they look at, and what would they notice? Would they be looking for the architecture or the people's clothing or their hair, or like what is their sort of actual perspective when they walk somewhere and talk somewhere, and what choices would they make based on the past that I've given them, and sort of figuring that out. And then I would say after like 100 pages or so of a draft, I kind of know them a bit better, and then it makes the rest of the book a little bit easier to write because I can sort of understand them and understand their motivation and understand how they would act in different places without like thinking about it quite as much as I do at the beginning.
And I imagine the sort of the other side of that coin is after 100 pages, you probably have to go back and fill in some blanks
Oh, 100%.
or make some changes based on what you now know about,
Yeah,
this character or these characters, right?
for sure, for sure. And I do that often with the first 100 pages until I get them to a point where I feel like, right, I've seeded all the things that I need to seed to now move
Right.
forward.
So it sounds like the key to getting into character is having a tremendous sense of curiosity.
And I like that. I like that.
Oh, I'm gonna clip that for the video promo. Um, no, but it seems like I often think that authors, I think about superpowers, right? And if authors are superheroes, what would their superpowers be? And of course, there's this ability to put words on a page. But really, a lot of people can do that. But what I think sets authors apart is sort of an enhanced sense of empathy for other human beings and this curiosity that fuels the way they look at the world, and just thinking about, okay, well, what would this person do given this person's backstory, given the situation you put them in? It takes a tremendous amount of curiosity to do that and have that be your fuel.
That's really interesting. I like that a lot. Yeah, and I think too, it's the idea of understanding that we don't all think the same way and we don't all react the same way, and that everybody is sort of past and previous experiences as well as their personality and a million other things kind of goes into the way we act and how we do what we do, and sort of being able to look at all of those things and pull them together and then create a person from all of those details that then feels kind of rounded and fully formed and understandable. Because there are some people who say that they don't like some of my main characters, and I'm cool with that. I don't like everybody I meet either, but my goal is that they understand them, and that's always like my hope in real life, that even if I don't agree with how someone acts or it's not how I would act, I always want to be able to understand where they're coming from.
Yeah.
And understand why they're doing what they're doing, and sort of then what that informs how I react to them or respond to them.
Mm-hmm.
And that's sort of what I hope about my characters too, that whether people like them or not, they understand them and they understand why they're doing what they're doing.
How did it feel when you were informed that The Light We Lost was chosen as a Reese Witherspoon Book Club pick?
I was totally floored. I was totally in shock. Like I like, it didn't even really process entirely. Like it took a little bit of time before I was like, wait, that's real and that's going to be life changing. And I'm so grateful to Reese Witherspoon, and I will be grateful to Reese Witherspoon for my entire life for making that choice. And I still have no idea why she chose my book, but I'm so glad she did.
Well, clearly she saw something in it that she liked. Have you got to meet her and work with her yet?
I haven't met her. I haven't met her in person, but I would love to one day.
Well, what can you share with us about your latest novel, Stars in an Italian Sky?
So it's a dual time period novel. So one story takes place in Italy in 1946, just after World War II, and the other story takes place in New York City in 2017. And it's about the grandparent and grandchild generations of the same families. And there are two love stories, and there are family secrets. And I was saying this morning, an author friend of mine who read my book said, so it's a book about making love and making wine. And I was like, yeah, that's basically it. It's a book about making love and making wine.
Well, I mean, if you just put that on the cover, it would certainly get my interest. But what's it like writing dual timelines? Was this the first time you've attempted to write a dual timeline, or?
Ish. So in my novel, Everything After, there is a dual timeline, but it's in the same person's life. So you get her diary, and then you get, from years ago, and you get her reality from now, and it goes back and forth so you can see how her past influences her present. So it is dual timeline, but in a different way, I think. This is the first book that I've written where it's two different characters, two different sets of characters, two different worlds, two different locations, and the timeline for one of them, is so much earlier than the other, not just a 10 or 15 years or whatever. So I had a lot of fun. I mean, I had a lot of fun researching for the 1946 Italy piece. I mean, I read tons of books, and I spoke to a ton of Italian professors some of whom cousins connected me to, and some of whom I randomly reached out to because I liked their YouTube videos and I had some more questions. But I really wanted to get that time period right because it wasn't a time that I'd experienced. And, I wanted to make sure all the details were right. And my amazing Italian publisher did a whole detailed check for me and found all of these mistakes I made that I'm so grateful that she caught. And then, but I wanted them to go back and forth. I could have written this novel where it was like part 1 is Italy in 46 and part 2 is New York in 17, and done it that way. But what I wanted to do was show how the past and the future are connected, and show the way that what happens in the past really informs the future, and then plant things in the future that then show up in the past. So I wrote it that way, but then when I revised it, I actually pulled both timelines apart and I revised them as their own stories, and then I put them back together again.
So it took, I mean, that this was not a short process, I imagine.
No, I think the entire book took me about 2 years to write.
Wow.
A little, like a month shy of 2 years.
What inspired you to write about Italy in 46 and have that as part of the setting?
So my husband and I are both half Italian, my father's family and his mother's family. And we went over to Italy in 2019, and it was our honeymoon, and we decided that we were going to spend a week of our honeymoon visiting his cousins in northern Italy. And one of his cousins is actually his mother's cousin. He's a man in his 80s, and I think of him as the man who would have been Count. So he would have been the Count of Saluzzo and the Marquis of Rocca if the Italian nobility hadn't been abolished with the monarchy in 1946. So we were spending time with him and with his sister, and she started telling us about the referendum, which I hadn't known pretty much anything about before she started talking to us about it. But as she was saying it, I was thinking, what must that have been like when, this man who would have been Count was probably around 10 years old, and this life he thought he was going to have, this, sort of promised future was eradicated by popular vote, which also was the first time that women voted nationally in Italy. So I thought that's so interesting. Like what a time that must have been. And then my family, my husband and I always joke about this, but my family in Italy was descended from shoemakers. So like what would have happened if he at that point was in a relationship, probably clandestine, sort of scandalous relationship with the daughter of a tailor, and then they find themselves on two sides of this political question. And then how does that, challenge who they are and their relationship with each other, and what does that mean for them? So that's sort of where the idea for the story got sort of born. And also because when we were in Italy, I went to visit my Italian publisher, who, while we were chatting, was like, "You should write your next book in Italy." And I was like, "I don't really know about that." But then I got this idea, and I was like, "Nope, I'm going to write my next book set in part in Italy."
Well, there's that curiosity that I was speaking about before, because anyone else may have heard that story, about the referendum in 46 and the cousin who, would have been Count, and just maybe just let it go there. But you let your mind chew on it for a bit. and it kind of
Yeah.
fueled what became Stars in an Italian Sky. So that's so cool.
Yeah, it was fun. It was fun to learn more about it, to sort of I just always find it so interesting. And it's why I love reading historical fiction, um, to kind of learn these bits of history that I didn't know about from school. And, I always really enjoy a novel when I find out something new about the world that was old.
Yeah.
It's like old information that I'm learning for the first time. And that's sort of what got me excited about researching this book.
Yeah. And not fueled by a breakup.
No, not at all.
Actually,
By
quite
a
the
marriage,
opposite,
in
right?
fact, right?
Exactly. I was going to say, because you were on your honeymoon at the time.
That's
So
right.
it's you kind of, I don't want to say coming full circle, but it's just interesting how those two books were different, or fueled by something different. Well, I always like to get to know my guests a little bit more through pop culture. So I'm curious, Jill, when you were growing up, what were some of your favorite TV shows?
When I was growing up,
When you were growing up, yeah.
Full House for sure. I have two sisters, so we were very into Full House. Um, Also Blossom. I loved Blossom. I loved her hats. I bought a bunch of those hats, or asked my mom to buy me those hats with big flower in the center. Um, we were very into the Disney afternoon cartoons. So it was Chip 'n Dale Rescue Rangers. I think the one with Scrooge McDuck, where
Oh,
he has
DuckTales.
DuckTales. Yes, thank you, DuckTales. Um, and I think before that, I was recently talking to a friend about an early childhood favorite book, TV show, which was Zoobilee Zoo, which had starred like Ben Vereen, which was kind of amazing.
Oh, wow.
And they were all these like people, but dressed up as animals. So I think he was maybe a lion or something. There was someone who was like a cockatoo, and they sang and they lived in Zoobilee Zoo. I don't know. I loved it. It was weird, but I loved it.
I mean, certainly an interesting later in life career choice for Ben Vereen.
Yes. Yes.
What about now? What do you enjoy watching now, if anything?
I'm pretty bad at television, to be honest. During the pandemic, I had discovered that my husband had never seen Star Trek, any form of it. So literally, when there was nothing else to do and we were locked down, and I also was pregnant at that point in time, we watched every single episode of any version of Star Trek that had ever been created, including movies. We calculated it. I can't even tell you how many hours we spent watching Star Trek. But that's the crazy kind of thing we do with like pop culture now, is we'll make a commitment to like binge watch a ton of something. So our recent one, which we're almost done with now, because I had chosen Star Trek, my husband chose NCIS, which neither of us had ever watched. So we started at the very beginning, and now we're actually finishing up, I think, season 19.
So going back to Star Trek, did you have a
Yes.
favorite incarnation of any of the Star Treks?
Yes. I mean, so the reason that I knew Star Trek was my dad was a huge Star Trek fan. So I watched Next Generation with him when I was a kid. And I was very into that one. But my personal favorite is it called, now I'm gonna mess up the title of this one. Is it Voyager, that has Captain
Voyager.
Janeway?
Yes,
Yes.
Voyager.
Captain Janeway.
Was that Kate Mulgrew? Was she
Yes,
the captain?
Kate Mulgrew. She was Captain Janeway. And I don't know if it's just because it's the one with the girl captain, the female captain, the woman captain. But that one I really like. And I also like how they're just so far away from everywhere, and they're kind of living in this space where they know, for at least for a while in the show, they accept that like they don't know if they're going to be able to get home ever.
Yeah.
And And that's really that was really interesting to me.
I just started watching Picard, which I was a big Next Generation fan. And I kind of outgrew the whole Star Trek thing. Then I was looking for something to watch the other night. I've got Paramount, and I'm like, this could be interesting. And I was like roped in from the first episode. I'm like, wow, this is actually really good. Like, you forget how good of an actor like Patrick Stewart is.
He's really good. We watched the first season of Picard, but then it was on hiatus while we were doing NCIS. But now it's back for a second season. And when we finish NCIS, that's our next. We have to go back and do that one.
Yeah, and I think they bring back some of the like most of the people from the Next Generation in season 2 or season 3. I don't remember. I think there could be a third season now.
Oh, is it? Did we watch? Then we watched the first 2. We watched however much there was,
yeah.
And then there was a break. But yeah, they brought back my personal favorite from Next Generation, Deanna Troi.
Oh, she was my favorite too.
Awesome.
Counselor Troi. What a great character she was.
Yeah, yeah. So I was very excited when they brought her back.
Well, now that I've exposed my nerdiness.
And I have exposed mine.
How about music? What did you like listening to when you're growing up?
Growing up, I was into like Debbie Gibson and Tiffany. I had their records on my little Fisher-Price record player. Also, I had a pocket rocker. I don't know if you remember those, but they were like these tiny, tiny little tapes. And I had one, it was like one song on either side. And I had Walk Like an Egyptian on one side and Manic Monday on the other side.
Oh.
And I was very, very into that pocket rocker tape.
Two great Bangles hits right there.
Yeah. Yeah. That was great. And then I feel like as I got older, I kind of got into like a little more classic rocky-ish. I listened to a lot of Meatloaf, Beatles stuff. As you can tell, I'm not very cool.
No,
I'm like
I think it's all
cool person.
But I'll make a connection because was it Debbie Gibson or Tiffany? I can't remember. Did a cover of a Beatles song. I saw you standing there.
That's right.
Yes, there's an overlap there. There's a through line to your musical tastes.
There is a through line. There is a through line.
Yeah, Meatloaf was great. He lived in my town. Here, I'm in Connecticut. He lived in Stamford, Connecticut. Had a house here, raised his family here. So Meatloaf was a fixture on the scene. We'd see him in the mall. Like I'm talking like in the mid '80s. We'd see him walking through the mall. The Meat Man.
That's fantastic. That is fantastic.
Yes.
I grew up on Long Island, so I was always a big fan of Billy Joel. I played piano as a kid. I played Piano Man.
I saw him this past summer at Madison Square Garden, and I mean, it was such an experience. I literally broke down crying 5 times during that show. Just amazed that I was there.
He's amazing. He's amazing.
Such a good performer, storyteller. Sounds great.
Mm-hmm.
Looks great. I mean,
and his songwriting. I just think. I mean, he writes stories. His songs are stories.
Yeah.
And I always really admired that about him, and even more so now. And then, I was going to say after September 11th, I listened to Bruce Springsteen's "Rising" on like repeat. That was an amazing album.
That song gives me chills every time I hear it, just knowing what it's about. Yeah. Just gives me such chills whenever I hear it. Such a great tune. This one will likely be a softball for you, given the story behind your first novel. But in what ways has writing been therapeutic for you?
I mean, I think it actually keeps me together. Like I think it's how I process the world, and it's how I process experiences. And I think that being able to channel what's happening into fiction and then sort of take a step back from it has really been like a mental health thing for me. And even being able to write Stars in Italian Sky during the pandemic and being able to escape there, but also the idea, of looking at the parallel of post-World War II Italy and post-pandemic Earth, and sort of seeing how like writing about that time was almost a way of reassuring myself that like the world has seen disaster, the world has seen cataclysmic events before, and we come out on the other side changed. The world has changed, but human by human, we can be okay.
Yeah.
So I think in writing Stars in Italian Sky, it was both an escape and a reassurance for me.
Yeah. And then going back in time a bit, if you were able to write a letter to the younger Jill, maybe it's the Jill who wrote about the cat who squishes itself into a mat, whatever its pet. What kind of words of advice would you give your younger self if you could offer your younger self some words of advice?
I was just in another podcast where someone had asked me that question, and what I had said was that I always thought writing was so much fun. Like when I was a kid, I just loved writing stories. I just thought it was like a really enjoyable thing to do. And when I started selling my books and started thinking about, the pressure of and the response and the reaction and all of that, I was worried. I was worried that it wouldn't be fun anymore, that the actual process of creation wouldn't be fun. And while there are definitely, things to think about and anxieties surrounding other aspects of book publishing, for me, the writing is still fun. It's hard sometimes, and it's frustrating sometimes, but in the end, it's always fun. And I think I would reassure myself that, like, if you want to pursue this, you won't lose the joy you are finding in writing right now.
Yeah, I think some people do realize that when writing is the fun part, but when it comes time to selling and promoting, that's when it kind of feels like work. And if you're doing it to make a living, will that take away the joy from it? But it sounds like no, it won't necessarily take away the joy.
Yeah, at least not for me. At least not right now. Who knows?
Right.
Talk to me in 10 years. We'll see if it's different.
That's right. After you have, more bestsellers under your belt. Well, the book is Stars in an Italian Sky. I imagine it'll be available wherever books are sold. Jill, if people want to get in touch with you or follow you on social media, do you have any recommendations of where they should look?
Yes, I have a website, jillsantopolo.com. And if you go there, you can go to the events page and find out where I'm going to be on tour for Stars in Italian Sky. And then I hang out a lot on Instagram. I post a bunch. I really like Instagram. I sometimes cross post with Facebook, so I'm there too. I'm parked on Twitter, but I never ever use it. So you can find me there, but you won't find anything new there.
And have you ventured into TikTok yet?
Okay, so I'm going to confess something, which is that I have a fake name on TikTok because I wanted to figure out how TikTok worked, and I wanted to go on as not me. So there's a fake me on TikTok with no picture or anything, but I mostly just use it to watch TikToks. I haven't created a TikTok because I'm really intimidated by it.
I don't blame you. I haven't figured that one out either. But Jill, this has been a fun conversation. Thank you for stopping by Uncorking a Story and letting me uncork yours.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. This was great.
Thanks for listening to Uncorking a Story. If you'd like more information about today's guest or to find out more about Mike, go to uncorkingastory.com. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe, rate, and review us at Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you get your podcasts. Tune in every week to hear Mike Carlin uncork a new story.